Joining me now is Quentin Fulks. He's the principal deputy campaign manager for the Biden-Harris campaign. Quentin, good morning to you. Thank you for being with us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Quentin, I want to play part of that ABC News interview of the president and ask you about it on the other side. Let's listen together.
And if you stay in and Trump is elected and everything you're warning about comes to pass, how will you feel in January?
I feel as long as I gave it my all and I did the goodest job as I know I can do. That's what this is about.
Quentin, I want to get your sense of that response, because that seems to be central to the question, right? There are not people who would otherwise support a Democratic candidate or the president himself who don't think he would be a better president than Donald Trump, or a safer president for democracy than Donald Trump. The issue seems to be coming down to whether people can be convinced that Joe Biden can beat Donald Trump in November.
Well, look, I think that what the president was trying to say is that there's nobody that's going to fight harder to defeat Donald Trump than he is, and that he is going to give it his all, which is what we've seen him doing in the wake of a performance which he himself admits wasn't his best. But we have seen the president go out. We have seen the president go to speeches, fundraisers, continue to do the work of somebody who is running to be president of the United States. And I think that that is what the president is saying. We also heard the president lay out the stakes of this election and the fact that Donald Trump does not care about himself. He likes to use the term morals of an alley cat, but that is factual. That is who Donald Trump is. And when has Donald Trump done anything for anybody but himself? It's the only reason that he is in this race to begin with. And I think that President Biden was saying that he is in this race and is going to continue to work as hard as he can, and that he is the most qualified person. And for the past 3.5 years, he has been working nonstop to deliver for the American people.
And so, and I think no one could take issue with both the record of Joe Biden. In my case, I study the economy, and it's been very strong. But on a number of other issues, including a number of foreign affairs issues, and the fact that you're running against a guy who looks to be interested in dismantling democracy. However, that doesn't stop the fact that the Washington Post is reporting that the Virginia Senator Mark Warner is preparing to make the case to the president himself that he step aside. And after the debate, it took a number of days for either President Biden or the campaign to reach out to congressional members and leaderships. We've heard from some members of Congress who wanted to speak to the president directly that he didn't reach out and the campaign didn't reach out. Is that changing?
Look, the president has reached out to a number of elected officials. He's spoken to Speaker Pelosi, or former Speaker Pelosi. He's spoken to Leader Jeffries, spoken to Leader Schumer. He has met with Democratic governors in the White House. He has been doing call time, calling through members. So the president is reaching out. That is our campaign. We understand the strength of the Democratic coalition, as we have been utilizing them from the outset of this campaign to communicate to voters, as they are the best surrogates for what the president has done and under his leadership. And so we're going to continue to do that. But look, at the end of the day, the fundamentals of this race haven't changed. The horse race in this race have not changed. We just saw a poll this morning showing that the president has narrowed all swing states. In states like Wisconsin and Michigan, he is actually leading. So we're going to continue to put in the work to make sure that we are communicating to voters, because the campaign that runs the hardest and communicates to as many people as they can is going to win. And while we're communicating to those people, we know that the issues are on their side. When these voters continue to see President Biden deliver substance after substance in his speech, talking about the issues that they are talking about at their kitchen tables, that is what's going to decide this election, and that is where the American people are, which is why the fundamentals of this race have not changed. Nothing after the debate changed about the fact that Donald Trump wanted to rip away reproductive freedoms for women. Nothing changed about the fact that Donald Trump wants to give tax breaks to billionaires. Nothing changed about the fact that Donald Trump wants to be a dictator, and the Supreme Court, with their immunity ruling that he largely appointed, have now just given him the keys to get closer to that. And so that is why the stakes of this election haven't changed, and the voters know President Biden is on their side, and that is why they continue to have his back. And that is the leverage that we're going to continue to take into November and win this election.
So I get it, and we're not arguing about this. I think the fundamentals are the same. I think the record remains the same. Donald Trump's record remains worse than it's ever been. The issue still comes down to something the president said to George Stephanopoulos last night, something you've said to me this morning, that he believes, and I guess you believe, that he is in the best position to win this election, that no one will fight harder than he is. And there are people who validly believe that not to be true. How do you answer that? A fundraising email that you sent out concerned with the debate performance called those people who are worried about it bedwetters. So what's the president's plan over the next week or so to demonstrate Not that he's a better candidate, not that he'd be a better president, not that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. All of those things are provably true, but that he has the ability to win in a close election.
Well, look, I think he's got to continue to put in the work. You heard me lay out his robust travel schedule after the debate, going to do a speech on immunity, talking about extreme heat, going to a fundraiser in New York, going to Wisconsin to give a speech to thousands of supporters yesterday, continuing to do sit-down interviews. That is where the president's mindset is. He understands that he has to assure the American people, and that's why he's going to continue to robustly campaign with a robust travel schedule over the next several weeks to make sure that we're getting in front of as many voters as possible. I mean, look, and we're not arguing about this, but at the end of the day, no one can begrudge President Biden. Every single elected official that runs has to believe that they are the best option. They have to believe that they can represent the people, and they have to believe that they are qualified enough and understand the legislative system and can lead enough to get things done for American people. The stakes are extremely high. And when we see things like Project 2025 and Donald Trump continuing to double down on gutting government agencies like the Department of Education, using the Comstock Act to ban abortion medication from women, those are the stakes of this election, and President Biden believes that he is qualified, as he has demonstrated with his body of work, not just this past 3.5 years, but throughout his entire career, that he can lead. And that is what he is going to do, and he is going to continue to put in the work day in and day out on the campaign trail, as well as in the Oval Office as the leader of the free world, to make sure that Americans see that day in and day out.
Okay, so you talk about Project 25. I've got it here. It's too big to even bind in one book because it's 900 plus pages. It has a remarkable name. It's called Mandate for Leadership. Now, based on this, Quentin, and based on who Donald Trump wants to install in positions of power should he win, people like Stephen Miller, people like Vivek Ramaswamy, people like Rick Grenell, people like Kash Patel, and the very specific threats that they have made to seek revenge and retribution on those who oppose them, which, by the way, include you and me both. Is it important, or is it something you've thought about, for the president's cabinet and the president's advisors to be a bigger presence on television and on the campaign trail to emphasize the team that is behind this president?
It's absolutely important, and it's important from the standpoint of diversity and inclusion. It's important. You've heard the president say routinely that he wants an administration that looks like America. He has been the vice president to the first black president. He is the president to the first female vice president and black female vice president. He has put a black woman on the Supreme Court. His cabinet is diverse as America. And so it is absolutely important that people see that their perspectives are being brought to the table. And that is what the president's cabinet looks like. That is the work that is going in. And it's why the issues from a legislative standpoint and the policies that have been put in place over the last couple of years reflect a broad range of issues and topics and constituency groups because those issues are being brought to the table directly to the president by people that he has put in place. And so we are going to continue to do that.
Let me ask you, because we talked to our reporters, all the networks did, after the interview last night, and their word from the campaign in the White House was that they thought the president hit it out of the park in that interview. Do you feel that way?
Look, the president had a broad interview. He answered tough questions after a debate performance where everybody has been telling him that he should exit the race. And he defied expectations. I think that the president showed up. He just gave a speech. He answered every single question. He laid out the stakes, again, talking about the substance. He laid out his body of work for his career in the past 3.5 years, standing up for Americans' freedoms and rights across this country. And so, yes, President Biden delivered.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.